welcome everybody, and thank you so much for coming to this celebration of the writing and the legacy to UBC of Professor Jacob Zilber. I want to extend a particular welcome to his family and former students who've made a special effort to come. We really love having you back in these halls and love having you here, and are so grateful to you. Today, as you can see from the program, is going to be a little sort of mix of, or alternating some readings from his work and some people speaking about him. And I don't want to take up too much of your time, and I'm hoping we can keep things kind of intimate and friendly the way we like to do around here. So I'm not going to be jumping up like a jack-in-the-box in between every single thing to introduce people. I hope you can just sort of see where you are on the list and just get up when it's your turn and come up to the front, please, because we are videotaping this, and we are also recording it for our online students on the Otras. So I'm just going to read a very brief little biographical thing about Jake, and then we are off to the races. Jacob Zilber was many things, but first and foremost, he was a good and honorable man. Jake had many signal achievements: fought with valor in World War II, excellent and internationally respected author of short fiction, co-founder of UBC's Creative Writing Department and its Literary Magazine Prism, Canadian doubles tennis champion in multiple age categories, mentor and editor for generations of Canadian writers, many of whom are in this room. Despite all of his external accomplishments, Jake took greatest pride in his family, believing until the day he died that his wife Alice was the smartest and most beautiful woman he had ever known, telling his son that asking her to marry him was the best decision he had ever made. He was truly proud of his daughter Julie and his son Mike, remarking that "My children are my greatest work of art." So one of these works of art is going to kick things off for us today. You, Mike, please.
Thanks. Is there anything I can put this on? I can just hold it.
Oh,
I'll just hold it. That's fine. It's a Mac Air. It's really light. Yeah. It's okay. I'll just.
I didn't think of that.
I can hold this. This is fine.
Should we bring it here? Yeah. Oh, it's not.
It's cool.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just gonna. My voice is not that strong. I'm really glad. Thank you for coming. I'm really glad to be here. I was just saying to my sister that I live down in California, and I've been literally canceling gigs and teaching for the past 2 or 3 weeks because I'm recovering from pneumonia. I'm not contagious, don't worry. And so the one thing I did not want to miss was this, so I'll read as much of this as I can, but probably cut it for purposes of my voice and time. I've jotted down some memories during the flight up from San Francisco to give you a bit of flavor of my day out of my eyes. Like any other child, it could come up with 100 different ones than these, but these give you a taste. First off, I remember throughout my childhood that my dad's best instrument was percussion, more specifically a Smith Corona typewriter. First manual, then a mighty electric, even with self-correcting tape after a while. That machine roared and shook the house for many hours a day. My dad had an unbelievable work ethic and would often descend to his study, the whole family desensitized to the constant rumbling, rapping, and pounding from his mind and fingers. He was a 2 to 3 finger typist, but he had absurd speed, 100 words a minute. You would walk in to tell him dinner was ready, and he would look up, perhaps with yellow industrial strength headphones on to block out any sound, look up foggily, bemused, amused, or even a little irritated. Piles of crumpled up paper and boxes by his feet as he worked on this play or that screenplay or this short story. His work ethic was staggering, and he was indefatigable and consistent. When he wasn't writing, he would most likely be either reading a book or grading papers from his creative writing students. I remember he wrote the most generously detailed handwritten notes in his crabbed but legible print for endless student stories. He was meticulous and conscientious, so much so that I remember my mother getting angry with how much time he was spending grading at home with and yet apart from the family. She snapped, "Why do you always have to be so damn conscientious?" But he was, dedicated and truthful and meticulous and immensely committed to helping the students become better writers. He had a sly sense of humor, not rapid fire or quicksilver, or should I say Quicksilver, but occasionally he worked his way around to a very funny remark that surprised and delighted us all. The first joke I can recall him telling was when I was maybe 8. The family went to the revamped Vancouver airport and saw, for the first time, an automatic dispensing machine for parking tickets. Do you have to understand that long before tweets and Tumblr, the internet and smartphones, streaming and GPS, this was cutting-edge stuff. Anyway, Dad studied the dispensing machine for a few seconds, then pushed the green button and the ticket slid out. He took it and nodded gravely to the machine with just a curl of a smile at the edge of his lips. Thank you. We all laughed. And for the first time, I figured out that this very serious, quiet, reserved, and sometimes intimidating person could crack wise. He definitely appreciated humor in others and impressed upon me a very valuable lesson. A good comedian doesn't laugh at his own jokes, Mike. Most importantly, my dad instilled in me a love for the creative life and for learning, not to mention a passion for basketball and politics I have passed on to my son, Maclen. For questioning, for discussion, for debate, he was a true advocate of the examined life being the one worth living, and introduced me to everyone from Grape to Camus, to Bertrand Russell, to IWW folk songs and Joe Hill, to Mark Twain, to Marx, to Bakunin, to How to Be a Secular Jew in Highly Wasp Christian 1960-70 Vancouver, to you name it. We did not always see eye to eye on things, but he treated me as if my ideas mattered, were worth discussing and debating and exploring. Of all the things he opened my eyes to, the one I will always be most grateful for is jazz and saxophone. You see, I really wanted to play the drums. My folks vetoed that one as just too noisy. They thought of the clarinet, but my dad remembered battling the misery stick in high school, and so he suggested I try the sax, and I fell in love with it. I still recall him bringing home the first jazz record I ever heard, one he had checked out from UBC's library. It was the great alto saxophonist Sonny Stitt, and I had a photo of a train coming towards the camera with steam flying out. I can still hear the blues coming up from her inexpensive mono record player. I became hooked pretty quickly, and Dad's constant singing and whistling of Gershwin, Jerome Kern, Cole Porter, and other American songbook classics stuck with me. I got pretty good pretty quickly. 40 years later, I play, compose, and teach jazz, it all starting with those first notes on the sax that my dad suggested in 1970. The last time I saw my father was the end of March of this year. I had come up to do some performances at the Cellar Jazz Club with a partner in musical crime, the brilliant Portland guitarist John Stoll. By that time, my dad was too far gone to come hear us at the club. So the morning after our last gig, before we got in the car to drive back to the States, John and I went over to Louis Breyer Jewish Home for the Aged, where he and some other aged souls gathered to listen. My mother and sister were there, as was his beloved caregiver Jenny and his dear true friend Buddy Smith. Now, full disclosure, John and I are very modern jazz players. Not crazy frantic, but with complex rhythms and harmonies, not all that familiar unless you really know that world. From the same river as Louis Armstrong, but further downstream past the rapids of John Coltrane and Miles Davis. But for him, we played every old chestnut that I could remember him loving, from Scarlark to Willow Weep for Me to Lady Be Good and so on. We played them sweet and soft for him, and even though his mind was pretty much gone, somehow he became alertly, intently focused, and got that completely engaged gaze, that one, that I remembered whenever he was involved in a serious conversation or seriously listening. And nobody was a better, more focused listener than my dad when he was interested. At the end of the performance, even though he could not speak anymore, he stared and held my hand and would not let go. There were tears in his eyes and mine. I told him I loved him and said goodbye. Maybe he knew it was the last time he and I would see each other. Who can tell? I had an inkling, though I always hoped I'd see him one more time. Anyway, I'm profoundly grateful that my father never once suggested that I have, quote, something to fall back on. Always believed in my music, and the very last time we saw each other, I was able to play some of his favorite songs for him on the instrument he introduced me to back when I was 10, and he was a decade younger than I am now. He was not a perfect man, but he was a good and decent man, one of my heroes growing up, and I miss his voice more than I can express. I believe he is with me whenever I play or write music. If you listen carefully, I think he may be singing or whistling right now. Thanks.
My name is Kevin Chong. I teach here. I'll be reading a short excerpt from one of Professor Zilber's short stories, The Prince. 2 days every month, S. Leon Kleinman told me sick. To avoid arousing suspicion, he had worked out an intricate scheme. First, there was a choice of days. Tuesdays and Thursdays were best, if not abused, for Monday and Friday suggested extended weekends, while Wednesday implied a midweek break. The circled numbers on Kleinman's calendar revealed the judiciousness of his choices. The problem of the telephone call itself had two parts, the time and the explanation. Calling at the exact moment the switchboard opened indicated conscientiousness. And so, precisely at 9 o'clock, Kleinman, having composed himself, would dial Universal Metals and ask for the first floor import office. When Ames, the secretary, answered, Kleinman would tell her he was not feeling well, that he would not be able to come in. Sometimes, however, if Ames seemed more skeptical than usual, he would elaborate. He was running a temperature, had a sore throat, was coming down with something, perhaps the virus that was going around. There had been a recurrence of an upset stomach. And frequently, and only when he felt the other excuses would not do, he would speak in a hoarse, rasping whisper, so effective that even Ames hoped he would take care of himself. Finally, there was the most delicate part of the plan, the return to work. To prepare this, Kleinman would stay up late the previous night and read until he could no longer focus on the work, so that when he entered the office in the morning, the dark patches beneath his eyes, and the sallow color of his cheeks, together with an occasional cough that racked his gaunt frame, testified to the truth of his sickness. Sometimes the meticulous and immaculately proper Kleinman would wear a particular white shirt, clean, but with a slightly fraying visible at the collar and the cuffs. On such days, he truly felt his part. Some jokingly predicted that he would be dead before he was 35. Kleinman, at work, furiously intent and energetic, seemed bent on actualizing this forecast. And the first floor department had smilingly advised the young man to pace himself. The advice went unheeded, and twice a month Kleinman was absent. On his sick days, he would go to the art galleries or the museum to look at paintings. He loved most of all the Renaissance. He would admire for hours the fine portraits of noblemen and burghers. He would make interesting discoveries about hats, robes, and collars. He would study the faces, the eyes, the mouths, the lights on the hand. Sometimes he would come close to inspect the brushstrokes, retreat for perspective, move to left or right, and smiling as if to say, "How could it be done so marvelously?" would move on. Sometimes he would stop on his way out of the museum and buy a book on Renaissance art. Since no one from Universal was likely to appear, Kleinman was luxuriously free. In his apartment at night, he would finally set the book aside and reach up with a pencil to cross the circled number on the counter. Exhausted, he would fall back in his bed and ask, "Who will Kleinman be tomorrow?" A clerk vegetating among the file cabinets in an office full of idiots. A clerk waiting dumbly for it. He would consult the calendar for an uncrossed circle. At 7 a.m., one hot July day, the alarm clanged. S. Leon Kleinman awake. His hand went out, the clanging stopped, and Kleinman lay back to listen to the jumbled morning sounds. Outside, the windy traffic rush, peevish horns, the roar of a bus, high shouting voices in the socket of a rubber ball against the building. Above, furniture scraping mysteriously. An object dropped. Down the hall, the flushing of a toilet. And in his room, a faucet rattled. Kleinman sighed and opened his eyes to see the small and framed reproduction of the portrait of a Renaissance prince. It was warped, and one corner had lost its hold on the wall. Kleinman gazed mockingly at the portrait and said, "Why hasn't your descendant answered my letter?" A perfect scheme for swindling the government out of import revenues, and still the Prince of Universal Metals declines to answer. After all, he added, who is Kleinman? He closed his eyes. Trucks roared, traffic rushed windily, a ball socked against the building, horns honked, furniture moved above. As a prince, he said, I'd stick the plume of the city in my hat, patronize the arts, discard rich and beautiful women, travel and write a book of witty observations, The Prince and the Discourses. I would even, he said mockingly, take 3 sick days a month instead of 2. Today, for example, I'd invade the galleries to observe the painting I had donated to the museum. The clock said 7:30, and Kleinman sat up and clasped his knees. 2 days a month, carefully selected in space possible. 3, dangerous. Ah, he said to the portrait, the scheme was perfect, swindling the government. And still, the Prince of Metals declines to answer. The Kleinman won't go to the museum today. He will vegetate like an onion among the file cabinets in an office full of idiots, and wait for the first time he can be sick once more. I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Linda Svensson. I'm a professor in the Creative Writing Program, and I bring words from Jake's students. This is from Don Dickinson. Decent, generous, patient, and humble, Jake was what I have learned since being his student is a rarity for these times, a truly civilized man. You made me want to do better, Jake. Thank you. And from Dennis Foon, I knew Jake as a gentle and supportive teacher, a man who gently coaxed and never prescribed. He was a good man, a fine mentor, and a total mensch. I feel lucky to have had him in my life. Thank you, Jake. And from Morris Panich, he made a lasting impression on me as a mentor, as a lover of writers and the art of writing. I remember how open-minded he was and how supportive of his students. He always took a genuine and deep interest in what I was writing well after I had left the department, even contacting me on occasion to catch up. Jake loved what he did, of that there is no question, and that love and generosity is a lasting gift to a whole generation of artists who he nurtured and inspired. And from me, I will always have boundless gratitude to you, Jake, for your confidence in me, not only as a writer in multi-genres, but in your belief that I could serve as a professor in our creative writing fortress and sanctuary. You always said yes to all of us, Jake. Go live, go show, not tell, go fly, go write. Thank you.
My name is George Bowering. Before I came to UBC, I lived in a dicky little town up in the interior, which was even dickier then than it is now. And I was lucky enough to be able to listen to jazz on the radio because it existed in those days. And I also knew somebody in town who gave me a bunch of jazz records, but I never had a record player. That was unfortunate. But I read lots of books, and I was always reading, and I thought, well, maybe I could do something like that myself. Luckily, when I came here, it was 1957. That was the first year of creative writing, if I remember rightly. And yeah, it was a program that when they still had enough sense to keep it in the English department. And the creative writing department was started by Jan de Brun and Jacob Zilber. I never took a course from Jan de Brun, but I immediately glommed on to Jacob Zilber, and I thought, oh my God, I've found the guy. Because when I was a kid growing up in this sticky little town up in the interior, I never met a Jewish person. But in the books I was reading, there were all these Jewish intellectuals. And they're my heroes. And I came out and met Jake, and I thought, oh my God, at last I met him. And I said, you must be from like Manhattan, I guess, eh, right? Or like some other borough in New York. And he said, well, no, I'm from Wisconsin. And I said, oh, well, okay, I guess that maybe kind of counts because it's still like east of here. And then he told me he was from a dairy background. Could that possibly be true?
Tiny little town.
Yeah. So oh, okay. I later on went and visited as a kind of homage, and I drove through that whole part of northern Wisconsin, and on every barn it says fireworks, cheese. Isn't that true? Which is basically what Jake was. And I loved him. He had this. I keep thinking about what did I like about him the best? Two things: storytelling. In fact, you were really lucky if you got with him over something that took time. Like, for instance, one time he drove us down to, I can't remember whether it was University of Washington or University of Oregon, but we went down in 2 cars, and I fought my way to be able to sit in the front seat beside Jake on the way down, and he told stories all the way down, some of which I think may have had a tendril of truth in them. Did you ever know him? Because and the other thing was humor. He had this wonderful sense of humor, and it's beautiful because when he was doing something humorous, he didn't smile. Right? He had this little look on his face, but it wasn't a smile, and his big brown eyes would get like even bigger. Right? It was wonderful. So what he did with us was he said, you have to do an assignment every week and a half over a period of 2 semesters. You had to write like a short story, part of a novel, you had to write a long poem, you had to write a screenplay, you had to write a TV thing, you had to write everything, right? And you had to do one every week and a half. is it still that tough around here? So you had to wind up doing like hundreds of pages over it, and I would write all these stories about, these gallant stories about suffering young in-love guys flying airplanes and all that stuff, and they were terrible, just awful, and he would give me a mark much higher than I deserved. And then one day I said, oh, to hell with it, and wrote a story about a one-legged bird, seagull in Stanley Park, and he said, at last you have found your voice. The nicest thing I ever heard. I said, okay, at last I pleased Jake. Now, and I forgot I was going to mention what I love when I look at him. He had a pipe, right, always, and he had like a tweed jacket, and he had a soft button-down shirt, and a little sort of like tie that went with it, and corduroy pants and stuff like that, and this pipe, and he would say, and I said, perfect, that's the guy I want to be. So then, as soon as he said, okay, you've pleased me, you've found your voice, I said, now I've got to find some way of getting past this guy, right? I've got to do something like that, something that he would hate. And so I spent the rest of my time doing that, and here I am. But I think it's wonderful to be back in the spot. It was in this building that I first met Jake Zilber. And I'm so glad that, I hate this room, but I'm so glad that we're in this building so we can say hello to him again, and thanks.
Hi everyone, I'm Chris LeBlanc. I'm an undergraduate student in the department here, and I'm going to be reading a section from his autobiography, Boxing and Other Reflections. Speaking of my attempts to do good, the biggest regret of my mother's life, I think, was that she couldn't read or write. Even if I was eating, I liked to have a book or magazine to look at. One time I was at the kitchen table, and I saw my mother, who was seated at the other end, turning the pages of one of my readers. And when she noticed me watching, she smiled and said, "You see, I read faster than you. I look at the pictures." She told me that when she first came to America in 1917, my father put her in a class where they tried to teach English to greenhorns, so she put it. I was too scared, she told me. I ran out. It wasn't the Pa's fault. The Pa's a good man, never forget. My mother had a story she liked to tell about my introduction to formal education. My brother had gone to kindergarten, but I decided against it. My mother tried to coax me, but I stood fast. She took hold of me, hauled me out of the house, and dragged me right up Milwaukee Street to the school, me literally kicking and screaming every yard of the way. She would tell people, as soon as he saw the slide, he went in the room. When I come to get him, he didn't want to go home. She took care of the store while my father made periodic trips to Green Bay to buy foodstuffs at the wholesale, and then went out in the country to buy and sell furs and hides. He was a junk man too. He'd buy scrap metal, mostly from the farmers, and sell it to Mr. Schuster, who had a junkyard in Green Bay. He was always up very early to get a jump on the day, but also because he didn't sleep well. He was an asthmatic and sometimes had trouble breathing. I would hear him hacking his lungs out at night. While he was on the road, people phoned the store and asked for things to be delivered when he got back. My mother kept track of the orders with a pencil and paper. She drew pictures and made marks for the amount. This was not Cézanne, but still she knew what it was. On top of that, she had to remember who had phoned. One day I told her I'd teach her how to write. I was 10, I think. Yes, 10. She didn't want to. Well, she did, but she didn't. She was afraid, you know how it is. I can't learn. Yes, you can. I have a dumb head. No, you don't. Finally, she gave in. The first thing I decided to do was show her how to write her name, Mrs. Zilber. I don't know why, it just seemed a good place to start. To me, even though I was a kid, writing your own name wasn't huge difficulty. But then you think about how hard it was to learn to tie your shoelaces. My mother was making some headways, slow but still. I forget how long we did this or why we stopped. I believe that if I'd insisted, she would have kept on, even though she'd always tell me to go out and play with the other kids, and not to bother my head, and in the end, I did go out. I think about that from time to time. I have great admiration for people who teach immigrants or others who can't read or write. Alice is considering doing that as a volunteer when she retires from teaching.
Hi, my name is Anna. I'm an MFA here at UBC and editor at Prism International. It's a great honor to be at Jacob Zilber's meeting. And I have the task of channeling Wei and Choi, which is pretty impossible, but here goes. Why Jacob Zilber matters to me when I stare at a blank page. In September of 1958, I walked into my first UBC short story writing class, innocent of the struggle of the academic team who fought for recognition of the fledgling creative writing program. A team headed by Earl Burney battled against the colonial mindset that gripped many of his colleagues. The latter felt creative writing could never be, and or shouldn't ever be, taught at all. Memos flew through the Buchanan building like knives. The Cambridge-educated head of classics even declared the inevitable collapse of the English department. What a waste of time to take Canadian writing seriously. Innocent of all this outrage, I walked into my first short story class. Immediately, Jacob Zilber greeted a dozen of us. With his quiet, unassuming manner, so natural to him, we had to hold our breath to hear his words. Calmly, he set down the workshop rules and expectations. Shall we look at this first story? It was mine. I stopped breathing altogether. By the end of my first year, I knew that our gentle Jake had fought the vicious machinations of department politics side by side with Professor Burney. In spite of the academic knockout battles with their enemies, reported to us by certain graduate assistants, I barely believed that Jake would even swat a fly. Jake, with his characteristically shy smile, was definitely not a rousing, contentious man like Earl. Turns out, I only knew for sure he was one of my best teachers, so patient with all of us. In 1961, I babysat for Jake and his wife Alice. They had Michael, then age 2, and Julie, age 6. I got to know the whole family, diapers and all. In 1962, I left Vancouver to live in Toronto. I became a teacher of English. The Zilbers and I kept in constant touch. 20 years later, in 1992, I was offered a contract to write my first novel, and then 2 memoirs, plus a companion novel to the Jade Peony. Throughout those years of writing, Jake and Alice took me into their home for whole summers of writing time. Jake pored over my drafts. Needless to say, Jake influenced and greatly enhanced the writing of all of my 4 books. Through the nearly 5 decades of our relationship, I observed his consistent sense of decency, the just and thoughtful way with which he dealt with every problem and every challenge that came his way. In darker times, I have witnessed and certainly experienced how much he and Alice discreetly risked and shared of themselves for those in trouble. That was their way. I think of how they first met. He, Jacob Zilber, the handsome young man who had fought in the American military as a boxer. Yes, truly, he boxed and was a serious winning contender. And Alice, trim and elegant, had been a serious student of ballet. Then the handsome boxer and this beautiful ballerina fell in love, married, and had 2 wonderful children. Surely a happy ending. All their years together, they have been as one person, indivisible in their love for one another. What happiness for me to know the man himself, but what a deeper happiness for me to realize that Alice's loyalty and faith in him had fortified his floundering moments. What an illusion for me to think of Jake alone. He never has been alone, and every so often, as if surprised again by what he felt was his good fortune, he told me that he would be so much less if he were not with Alice all these years. Somehow, I became important to them. Jake taught me to structure my stories, to vary my sentences for their music, but Alice would clarify details he and I both somehow missed. Prevailing over all the decades of their mentoring, Alice and her family, in their daily living, taught me to write about decency and love, and finally, when Jake became ill with Alzheimer's, they each taught me about survival and not surrendering to the dark. Julie, Michael, Alice, all surviving above what would remain an unjust and final journey. Lately, back in Toronto, staring at a blank screen and feeling as if I have lost my way, I somehow sense Jake is with me, standing over me, steadying my panic. No one has more gentle eyes than his. I am calm again. But as I write, I also sense someone else is with him, as she always has been since I first knew him. Someone indivisible from the man himself. His longtime companion and best friend, Alice, is also there, gently smiling back at me. I stare at the blank page. I know that the words are struggling to emerge. I also know that the great themes are already there. They are there because Jake and Alice, for me, had been and are still as one. And so I write and write and write. Thank you, dearest Jake. Thank you, dearest Alice.
I'm Grape. I teach screenwriting in our online program, but my relationship with the department actually started back when I was a student here. I did my MFA here from 92 to 94, so I just narrowly missed the opportunity to work with Jake. But nevertheless, his legacy has had a profound impact on my life and my career. In 1993, I was the recipient of the Jacob Zilber Scholarship in screenwriting. And I remember at the time I was completely shocked and surprised to receive the award. I had entered the program as a playwright and had just completed, so very tentatively, my first ever screenplay in my first ever screen class. And so winning the award was a huge endorsement of my work, and it sort of bolstered my confidence in my voice as a screenwriter, and it inspired me to pursue a career in film and television after graduating from the program, something I would have never dreamed of before winning the award. And so here I am, some 20 years later, teaching back here in the program, sort of coming full circle. And it's my pleasure to introduce Rhianna Brown, the current recipient of the Jacob Zilber Scholarship.
And like Sarah, I also entered the program as a playwright, and remember when I got we find out via email in weird ways here, getting the email that morning and it just being such an affirmation. I've really fallen in love with screenwriting in the last year, and just having that sort of gentle nudge of like keep going is just so meaningful. So
Brandon and I, along with Tom and Russell, playwriting students here in the program, we are going to be reading an excerpt from Jake's play Verbrente Soup. And it was published in 1969 in the West Coast Review. Verbrente Soup, a play in one act. Setting: the author's apartment, a messy, seedy walk-up in Brooklyn. The walls are miserably green and pocked. There are papers on the floor, old magazines, forgotten pieces of clothing, paper bags, etc., and in one corner, some leaning stacks of paper and hardcover books. The furnishings consist of a sagging cot, badly camouflaged with a holey and cheap blanket, a beaten chair with most of the stuffing kicked out. In another corner, the author's working place. This consists of a kitchen chair in front of a table which supports a typewriter, a mess of papers, ashtrays, a cardboard carton for filing, the dried cores of apples, and a dirty dish. A second carton stands on end beside the table. The working place is lighted by a mangy floor lamp. There are two doors, one opening from the hall to other parts unknown, kitchen and bathroom. Time: a hot September night. Characters: the author in his early 30s, read by Tom Peters. Millie Toberman, his wife, 21, read by Rhianna Brown. Elmer Toberman, the husband, in his early 30s, read by Russell Hirsch. Pop Toberman, the father in his 60s, who makes an entrance much later in the play. At Rise, the author is sweatily hammering away at his typewriter. He pauses, shakes his head, and turns broodingly to the audience.
If I could do it, the one thing I'd like to do is sit home, here, if you can call it a home, and write one-act plays.
He stares at the audience meditatively, turns back to the typewriter, taps two keys, and pauses. A note is shoved under the door leading from the hall. He listens, waits, crosses to the note, picks it up, walks toward the audience, and opening the note formally, reads aloud.
Your rent is due. Pay up, or else. Signed, the landlord. Or else what?
Another note is shoved under the door. The author repeats his previous ritual, except that this time he reads aloud from the point at which he has picked up the note.
Watch and see. Signed, the landlord.
The lamp goes off. In the dark, the author moves forward toward it, picking his way across the rubble, knocks it with his hand, switches the button, and switches again.
If I could do it.
He rustles around on the table, finds something, strikes a match, finds and lights a candle. And after dripping wax into a dish from which he empties an apple core, he sets the candle in the dish and reestablishes himself broodingly at the typewriter.
The one thing I'd like to do.
A note is shoved under the door. He takes the candle, approaches the note ironically, picks it up, and takes it back to the chair.
It takes a heap of living in a house to make it home. Signed, your friendly landlord.
He stares at it, pauses, snaps his fingers.
It takes a heap of living.
Turns to the typewriter, puts a fresh sheet in, crumples, and throws the other one on the floor.
Scene 1. God is alive and living in a third-rate walk-up in Brooklyn. The sickening green walls soak up in the heat in summer and admit the wind in all other seasons. Defeated furniture, the literary smells of cabbage, and so forth. A scorching night in September created by the satanic figure of the invisible landlord. At rise, a dark-haired girl of 21 dressed in a white cotton blouse, black shorts, and thongs sits slumped before this television set.
He rises stickily, dumps odds and ends from the carton beside the table, and sets it by itself, stage center. Pulling a chair in front of it, he sits, concentrating like Rodin's thinker.
A battered, third-rate television set.
In the darkness behind him, the door opens silently and closes. The spot picks out a girl, dressed in a white blouse, black shorts, and thongs. She seems bewildered. The author turns and sees her.
An attractive, dark-haired girl.
Thank you.
At rise, you will be found sitting here in a slumped posture watching television.
Why?
All day, walk-up has burned beneath the landlord's sun, but for all that, the girl looks calm and cool.
He leads her to the chair.
She sits, slumping somewhat.
The girl complies.
She is smoking a cigarette.
I don't inhale.
That's good. That's the way I picture you.
Nervously, he hands her a cigarette and lights it with a candle. She puffs in a cool, sophisticated manner, exhaling through her nose.
Cool and sophisticated. Rather innocent. I don't know how we're going to show that you're not inhaling.
Show?
The author anxiously paces with the candle. He waves his hand towards the audience.
Them! The audience, Millie.
Who?
Millie Toberman.
My name's Titania.
Who ever heard of Tatiana Toberman?
If I can't be Tatiana, I'm leaving. Besides, I am definitely opposed to television.
Your name is Millie Toberman, and you'll be slumped before the television set for the very simple but compelling reason that you are a creature of my fertile imagination.
I am not a creature.
Would you rather be a figment? The poet's eye in a fine frenzy, rolling doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven, and as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Your name is Millie Toberman. You have the shape of an attractive 21-year-old, and this walk-up in Brooklyn of a hot September night is your local habitat.
He bows. She seems impressed and walks towards the chair.
Ginger ale, please.
He bows again, sets the candle down, and goes off stage. The girl, puzzled, sits on the chair, hesitates, then mimes turning the dials of the television set. The music of Swan Lake is heard. She quickly switches to another channel. Rock and roll is heard. She switches to another channel. Sound of running feet, pistol shots, heavy breathing, dramatic music. Cry, Frank! Women scream up as author comes back with a glass of ginger ale and switches dial back to Swan Lake. The girl stares at him as he hands her the glass, and she switches the dial back to the murder show with the sound of a voice saying, Frank was a rat! Trapped in his own trap! Author switches dial back to Swan Lake.
You're smoking a cigarette and drinking in front of the TV set, which is playing Swan Lake.
The girl mimes switching the dial.
I hate Swan Lake.
The author authoritatively switches the dial back.
Your face is the kind of tired but half-rapturous intensity that is sometimes visible when people have given themselves over to the magic of moving nothingness.
That's Swan Lake.
You sway your head in time to the music.
In a slumping posture?
Well, yes, of course, you know.
She shrugs, half complies.
You rise.
She does so.
With cigarette in one hand, glass in the other, you execute a few steps.
Girl executes a few steps ironically.
I'm a graceful, frustrated fawn who always wanted to be a ballet dancer and has taken to drinking ginger ale.
The author sits and begins to type furiously.
What's wrong with that?
The girl executes a ballet in which she alternately smokes, drinks, and pirouettes.
I'm sublimating. I seem to recall somewhat similar scenes from the frenzied pens of other geniuses.
That was altogether different.
The girl does a grossly comic version of Swan Lake.
What's this? Social protest?
The author flinches.
Domestic comedy?
He flinches again.
Kitchen sink realism?
He rips the sheet out of the typewriter and flings it to the floor.
Theater of the absurd?
It's not only absurd, it's downright ridiculous.
She stops dancing. He looks up hopefully.
Did you get that? It's not only...
Her look stops him. He rises, paces as she skims about in her ballet routine.
It's a blend of Jacobian pathos tinged with comedy, warmly human, and spiced with the mystery of Pirandello. But you know, there's one thing wrong.
You're writing a ballet, but you're tone deaf?
It needs a plot!
Get one quick, please.
I've got it! That's it!
Hurry!
The author rushes to the set and turns it off. He quickly leads the girl to the chair on which she sits, breathing heavily.
Yes, do you know what you're doing? You're waiting. Ha ha!
Waiting. Sitting and waiting. I don't know why or how long. 5 minutes? 10? Maybe I eat a cracker? 20 minutes? 1 hour? And then everyone argues about who it was that didn't show up.
No, you're waiting for your husband to come home.
But I'm only 18, and besides, I don't believe in marriage.
21, Millie, and you have a kid.
I had to get married.
It was all entirely proper.
How quaint. It's a warm family comedy. Boy or girl?
A boy. That's just the symbolism at the end.
His name is Isaiah, and it's going to be a religious parable for modern times.
His name is Junior.
Girl yawns, turns on TV set to rock and roll.
Junior.
The author snaps his fingers authoritatively. From off stage comes the sound of a baby crying. The girl ignores it.
She ignores the crying, but as it persists, we see that it is beginning to fan the flames of frustration.
Crying grows louder, more unhappy.
I'm neurotic and obsessive, married too young and trying to escape.
She rises with a half-mad look in her eye and becomes Medea.
Though he be fruit of my womb, I bore in bitterness and pain and gave suck at my breast. Yet one more gift shall I give, and that the gift of silence.
Shaping her hands into claws, she advances with stifled groans toward the bedroom and the sound of the crying.
Junior, my first, my only.
The author jumps up.
No, it's not that kind of...
As she continues panting and moaning, he rushes to the set and turns on Swan Lake. Immediately, she starts skimming about again, and the crying ceases when he snaps his finger. He returns to his chair and concentrates.
As she dances, she fails to notice that the door behind her has been opened, and...
An escaped criminal or maniac! He'll hold me hostage with a hint of possible assault.
She switches TV show to shootout, screams, dramatic music, but with a snap of the fingers, author restores Swan Lake. Girl stares at him, tries to make herself beautiful, and becomes very coy and graceful for the unexpected intruder. Author snaps his fingers. Spot picks out an owlish, bespectacled man in his early 30s who has just stepped into the apartment. He looks very tired and cynical. Girl swings about and is amazed with disappointment.
Your husband, Elmer.
He did it to me?
It?
The baby.
I don't remember if I...
You'll pay for that, Buster.
Elmer. Couldn't I be Rock?
Who ever heard of Rocktoberman?
This is a farce.
You've just come back wearily from your job.
He works for Willie Loman.
I'm a talent scout for television.
The girl's eyes widen. She gets up, turns on Swan Lake, and begins to dance.
You are?
The author snaps his fingers. Swan Lake cuts off.
You are the social worker for the young adults at the Young Men and Young Women Hebrews Association in Borough Park.
But I have no social work instincts. Generally speaking, I hate people. I don't even like myself too much.
You have to support your family, don't you?
How did it happen to me?
You were the one who was so eager for a baby.
Are you sure?
He'll tell you, that voyeur.
The author's shoulders droop.
What's the basic conflict? Life is a battleground. Who's fighting whom and why? What is it you want and that you can't get?
How come I'm social working young adults when I want to be a famous talent scout named Rock?
A plot. A plot! What this country needs is a good 5-cent plot.
The author,
Tonight, they argued for 2 hours whether to serve Cokes out of bottles or paper cups. At a young adult square dance, should you keep the Coke bottles hidden and serve the dancers from cups brought out from the kitchen, or do you roll the Coke machine into the dancing room and let people serve themselves?
He slumps onto the chair in front of the TV set.
Administered sentimentality. Is this what life is for?
He turns on the set. A boxing match is in progress. Announcer's voice. Turley with a left to the head and a right to the body, and a left jab to the head and a right to the body and another right, and Green is hurt. He's covering up against the ropes. Turley's pounding him with both pounds, and there's the bell. End of round 4. During these comments, author has moved to the door.
Where are you going?
As Hemingway said, the writing, she goes bad. One author in search of a plot. I'll be back, I guess.
The sound of a baby wailing.
What about us?
I have to see a man about a job. Why don't you do work on the plot in the meantime?
The husband has turned off the TV, and the girl motions towards the sound of the crying.
Would you mind shutting that set off for a while?
Author snaps his fingers, and the sound stops.
Oh, I almost forgot. Pop Tolberman is visiting you.
Who?
Your father. He's a scrap iron dealer in Fish Creek, Wisconsin, and he's been here for about a week.
Thanks for letting us know.
It's going to be a domestic Jewish comedy with a touch of pathos and kitchen sink realism. I prefer musicals.
That's strong.
So where is he, this father of mine? What's he want?
He came to see you and the baby. He's been living in a trailer in Fish Creek since your mother died.
She died?
After a lingering illness, I'm afraid.
It's going to be a lonely old man gambit.
The husband takes out a handkerchief and dabs at his eyes.
You killed my mother.
No, I didn't. She died a natural death.
Did she suffer?
To be truthful, somewhat. But he suffered more. You can't go against actuality. An author must see life steadily and whole.
We're in here with a pitiless killer.
Oh my. Oh my.
I'll be back in a while.
Wait, where is he? You didn't.
No, Millie will tell you.
I see I'm to be the scapegoat.
Better get on the job.
The author escapes. The door closes.
I don't like it. We're made out as figures of ridicule. I prefer to be a lady with a penthouse overlooking Central Park.
And one day I'd see you walking gracefully through the park with your Russian wolfhound. And I'd offer you an audition for a new TV drama. But a beautiful young girl with a Russian wolfhound.
She looks at him. He drops his gaze.
Where is this father, this Pop?
He went out for a walk about half an hour before you came in.
Did he say...
He never tells me anything. He just went.
He shouldn't be out by himself at this hour. Not in this neighborhood. Did you tell him it's dangerous?
He never listens to me.
Did he say when he'd be back?
Nothing.
I'm worried. Do you think that author...
He might. It's called foreshadowing.
I better go have a look around.
And leave me alone? Suppose your father comes back before you.
Well?
He'll blame me.
For what?
Everything. He doesn't like the way I take care of the apartment. He doesn't like the way I take care of Junior. He doesn't like the way I take care of you. And...
She begins to cry.
He hates my cooking.
It's that author. He's stirring up all the trouble to keep the plot boiling.
A domestic Jewish comedy with overtones of pathos and elements of the absurd set against a backdrop of kitchen sink realism. That bastard!
The baby starts crying.
I better run.
He never sleeps. And you were the one who wanted him. I'm just a cowgirl milkmaid and diaper-changing machine. He's just one big mouth. Look at me, used up at the age of 21.
She wails. The baby's cries increase.
That's very trite and self-pitying, you know.
You. Social work. Cliché.
Now I see. That's his plot. Don't you see, Millie? P-L-O-T. His four-letter word against you and me and Pop.
Oh, Elmer, what can we do?
Never despair, darling. You remain behind. I shall search for father, and then we shall dispose of the author.
Elmer?
Yes.
You hate me.
For God's sake.
He crosses and kisses her grouchily.
Elmer?
Yes.
Do you really like me?
For God's sake.
He gives her a resounding, extended, melodramatic kiss. Breaks off, looks toward the entrance.
Evidence of affection, though trite.
He gives her the rest of the kiss, draws himself up, and marches to the door.
Be brave, my darling.
I'll try, dearest.
She waves to exits. Baby continues to cry.
Here comes the cowgirl milkmaid diaper-changing machine.
She exits. Crying continues for a moment, is interrupted. Another brief cry, gurgling, silence. We'll end it there.
I'm winging it here because I only decided 2 days ago that I was going to come and speak.
Who are you?
Well, my name's Jamie Reed, and I was in Jacob Zilber's classes, and I went to undergraduate writers' workshop meetings back in the early 60s, up to about 1965. And when I heard about Jake's death, after his death, I just read about it by chance, and I had to remark on it on Facebook and various other places because I remembered him as a person who was always very serious about his students and what his students were doing. I felt that he treated me as a serious person, and I was very grateful to him for that. The first time I met him was when I applied to go into the short story class, and he turned down my short story, his entry into the short story class, when I first came to UBC. And I was devastated by that because I thought, oh, I was a great little writer. But he told me the story was too sentimental, and for the first time I found out what it was to be sentimental and how to maybe how to avoid it in writing. I don't believe that I have done it yet. I still haven't figured out the difference between sentimentality and sentiment. But Jake was a very different kind of person. He was a kind of person that I had never met before. Everybody else here has talked about his quiet manner. He was very, very quiet. There's no question about it. He was very, very modest in everything that he did. I can't tell you how delighted I am to find out that he was a tennis champ and a boxer. I never knew that. I mean, he wasn't the kind of person who would brag about it. And the other thing, I wanted, everybody here has already spoken about all the things that I wanted to talk about. So I'm going to go over it anyway. One of the things that I do want to say is that in the 1960s, when we were here, we were one of the first generations of people who wanted to be Canadian writers. And Jake Zilber was here for us to help us to do that. And I'm thinking of all the people that I know personally that were in the classes at that time that have become well-known writers. If you look them up in Wikipedia, you will find them there, and you will find pictures of their career there. So, of course, we have George Bowring here, who is first Canadian Poet Laureate. There is another writer that was close friends of all of us. Her name is Maria Hindmarch. She's not in Wikipedia, but she has written, to my mind, one of the great books written here in British Columbia called The Watery Part of the World, and I would really recommend everybody look that book up. There was Carol Johnson. She was here, and she studied playwriting here, and she took courses from Jake too. She was one of the founders of one of the very important theater companies in Toronto, and she was also for many years chairperson of the Canadian Playwrights Union. Robert Hogue was here, and he took courses alongside with me. Lionel Kearns was here, and he is a Wikipedia person. Daphne Marlatt was here, and she took courses from Jake too. And David Bromwich was here, and was an actual friend of Jake's. So there were many memories that crowded into my brain when I started to think about Jake Zilber, but there was not one single one that I could hang a discourse around. But I want to say about 4 things that I liked about Jake Zilber on first sight. George talked about them. The first thing that I liked about him was his voice and the way that he talked. All the other people that I knew in the world always talked in a kind of blustery and defensive or argumentative way. But Jake Zilber had this kind of quiet way of speaking that was just based on the investigation. Then an investigation that he made, and he always had a point that was at the center of it when he was speaking. It was the same with all of his comments, and everything that he saw, he looked into it and tried to deliver something important that you sort of had to listen to the way that his voice. I was trying to find an adjective that would describe his voice, and I couldn't. But you couldn't not pay attention to the way that he spoke, because he spoke so quietly, and he also spoke with such sincerity and with such actual depth. That's number one. The other thing George mentioned is dress. I just loved the way that he dressed. Yeah. I thought corduroy pants and his brown suit and his corduroy jacket sometimes, or his tweed jacket. It was not at all ostentatious, and it was not at all, but it was different from anybody else and very kind of casually, comfortably elegant. The other thing that I liked about him was his home, and that has been mentioned. We used to go there for the undergraduate writers' workshop meetings, and people have said that he was a homebody of a sort, and his home was one of a kind in a way. It was something that you could see that he valued very much, and I was always pleased there. And I'm so pleased to see Alice looking so young here. I haven't seen her for 50 years, so, and I remember her kindness. Okay, so the other thing about his teaching, Mike has mentioned, that he always spent so much time on the comments that he wrote, and it's true. This is the last piece of writing that Jake did anything for me. The first one was when he refused me entry to the creative writing class, and this one is an A. There we go. I think that's all I want to say. So.
I'm George McWhirter. I hope my voice starts to get better. I worked with Jake for a very, very long time. And let's start off at the beginning. I first met Jake in one of his key roles, which was as editor-in-chief of Prism International. Now, it was all over the name of a Catalan man, and his name appeared in 2 poems of mine that he was considering for Prism International. The surname of this man was Valls. Now, it's written with a V and pronounced with the VB Spanish way, and so it could almost be like balls. And I think, me being me, Jake suspected I was trying to put one over and being a smartass. So he goes over to Hispanics, to a Catalan man in Hispanics, and confirms that Welsh is actually a Catalan name. So that was my first encounter with Jake. He was meticulous, but also eclectic. He liked what the poems and where the poems were about, but most importantly, he fact-checked. Now, he could have been down over there in the East, as George puts it, with the New Yorker, but at the time, he was the editor-in-chief of Prism, and it was no mean shakes. It was among the top 20 literary magazines in North America that Krauss reprint selected to reproduce in hardback and sell to the universities. I know that because I deposited their check when I became managing editor for Jake for a year. In fact, we not only deposited that, but for a whole year, we covered a 2-year backlog of unserviced subscriptions and undeposited checks. So that pleased Jake no end, because I'm also going to be talking about Jake, the administrator, the man who lived through those memos flying like knives. And anyway, but I really got to know him when I inherited the chair of the departmental curriculum committee from him. Wow. No, anyway, he taught me to do what he had done. Now, what he had done was put through the proposal for the creative writing program and the creative writing department. He did all that terrible nitty-gritty work in our Republic of Academia, where you have to put the proposal to the Faculty of Arts to be voted on. You have to put the proposal to the Faculty of Graduate Studies. All that underground stuff where they'll kill each other to stop what they don't like. Anyway, he taught me, and most importantly, in those proposals, he taught me how to put together the argument for a course or a program. This meant, as you will see it on all the forms, the famous rationale. Now, to get somebody from Belfast to be rational, which is pretty damn hard. Now, but one thing that he and I shared was a love of argument. So he turned my love of argument into these rationales. And anyway, that was one of the main things I learned, to be a bit rational from Jake. Now, the man's influence on curriculum never really stopped, because he was on so many committees. He was on the committee that developed a proposal for a master's in journalism. He showed me it ages ago, and I remembered it later, many years later, about 15 years ago, and it became the template for what is now the School of Journalism. That was basically another of Jake's products. And we're in a place that that really values learning by doing. That was the big part of the argument between the English department and the creative writing department. Creative writing says you learn by doing. English says you learn by studying. Those who do it well. And anyway, Jake believed that it should be done. And he is, some people here, I think Karen is here, he set up an internship for screen and TV with the CBC. And one of the people who was part of that was Hart Hanson, Ian Weir, and Karen Peterson, who's sitting here. You were part of that internship. And that was extremely important. Guys made money as well as everything else. So there's the Jake who's in the woodwork that nobody ever really sees. He's like a caryatid. That's the main pillar that holds things up. It's a word that that Orwell used for the miners, the coal miners, who were the underpinning of the Industrial Revolution. Jake was like that. He was kind of in there at the bottom of everything, doing all the hard committee work. And he was very interesting in that he was single-minded, but he craved consensus. And it's a paradox, but that's the way he was. And only somebody like that could do what he did in 1983-84. That was the terrible year in BC when we thought everything was going to hell. The government in Victoria was sending pink slips with the RCMP up to the foresters, the government foresters in the woods. And the government was trying to bring through Bill 42. This was a bill where the government could fire any employee in their service without cause. There were mass demonstrations in the streets, there was a strike, and it was chaotic. But Jake set about doing his thing. His thing was to have a day of protest. And what did he do? He went to all of the presidents of the institutes of higher learning. He got them all together on the one stage to discuss the situation. And can you imagine it? Only a man who was single-minded and relentless and at the same time consensus-seeking could bring people together like that. So I have to say that. Now I'll end, like everybody else, by saying that he was my fiction teacher too. In the class I was in, there was another Barring. Marilyn was in Jake's fiction workshop at that time. A younger Marilyn Barring, teenage still. And anyway, he got me to change, right? Everybody, I don't know how he did it. Maybe it was, as you say, that look. Maybe it was the listening. But he got me to change or adapt from being entirely mythological in my approach to stories to being a bit more connected to ordinary matter. And then in my background, coming from where I come from, being Scots-Irish, hyperbole. Live off of hyperbole. And as soon as we cross the Atlantic, we become even worse. We become cowboys riding on the horseback of hyperbole. And I was one of those. But he also taught me how to understate. And how he handled me, as each of you has described how he handled you, was like the way he handled that ping pong ball and the tennis ball. He was an ace, and so was Alice. He was always beside him. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. This has been absolutely a treat and a pleasure. I want to say a particular thanks to all of our readers today: Kevin Chong, Curtis LeBlanc, Sarah Grape, Rhianna Brown, Tom Peters, who I met today for the first time, and what a pleasure it is, and Russell Hirsch, who I can't see where you are right now, but thank you all so much. I would also like to say an extra thank you to Ginny Monaco right at the back, who has been, to borrow George's phrase, the caryatid underpinning this reading, who has really been such a great help putting it all together. And finally, I would like to say an extra special thank you to the family for coming and being here and joining our family for today. Thank you all again so much. And I have a couple of parking passes if anybody needs them.